national interests of the Serbian Social Democrats, connected with the faction that from the early 1920s was known as the Right faction, in which the key personality was Sima Marković, one of the ideologists of the old Serbian social democracy, who was calling for pure class struggle, who was not at all interested in matters of peasantry, for whom the national question again was a bourgeois question, something that was not for the new communist movement. In 1920, a sort of a compromise solution was reached at the Second Congress of the Yugoslav Party at Vukovar, in which it was said that the Communist Party was on the defense of national unity and equality of all the nationalities of Yugoslavia. This is a contradictory statement because on the one hand, the expression of recognition of national unity was a compromise with the unitarists from the old Austro-Hungarian social democratic movement. On the other hand, the fact that the term all the nationalities in plural was used indicated a certain recognition of reality of pluralist makeup of Yugoslavia that would not be covered up by unitarist formulas. The Right faction continued this attitude of compromise, but basically shunned any notion of tactical support for the national movements. And of these, of course, the most important and effective was the Croat peasant movement of Stjepan Radić, that by the middle of the 1920s very seriously was shaking the Yugoslav state and presented a real alternative to the Belgrade government. From the point of view of the Right faction, this was something that ought not to be supported, because Radić and similar movements simply represented misleaders who were taking the masses away from the pure class struggle that the communists should lead. Needless to say, this attitude was very different from Lenin's attitude. Let's not forget that Lenin came to power, among other things, because he very clearly sized up the revolutionary potential in Tsarist Russia. Whereas the other members of Russian social democracy were like Marković and the Serbian Social Democrats, shunning any sort of role in the national struggle as something that would lead them away from class pursuits. Lenin thought that this was precisely the sort of a thing, an issue, that could be helpful to the revolutionary cause. Needless to say, being very precise as he always was, he wanted to define the terms of combat. To him, support was possible only where a movement existed. If it didn't exist, we shouldn't be, of course, engaged in creating it. But if it did exist, for example, Ukrainian national movement, and if it was calling for basically independence, this is something that revolutionaries in Russia ought to support, ought to give full priority in their work. Therefore, from the point of view of the Leninist tradition, that of course became official in the Comintern, what Marković and others in the Right faction in Yugoslavia, which was dominant in the early 1920s, were doing, was totally unacceptable, something that ought to be changed. More interesting is the attitude of the Left faction, which to a significant extent was a combination of rethinking of some of the unitarist themes among the old social democrats from Austria-Hungary and the attitudes of those Serbian socialists who took into account the realities of national conflict in Yugoslavia in the early 1920s. A typical representative of this Left faction would be somebody like Đuro Cvijić, who had roots in the nationalist youth, who thought that the South Slavic bourgeoisie betrayed unitarism, who thought that the revolution ought to create a Yugoslav nation, but who ultimately recognized that this whole notion was fantasy, that the national struggle that was developing, such movements as Radic's in Croatia, as various movements that were developing in Macedonia, in Kosovo, etc., were a response to oppression within Yugoslavia, were a response to white terror, something that ought to be supported. So such people basically totally changed their attitude on the question of establishment of an integral Yugoslav nation and started supporting movements that the right faction increasingly referred to in the same terms as the official establishment in Yugoslavia as basically separatist and nationalist movements. One Serbian socialist who participated in this same left faction and who went along with this new realization was Kosta Novakovic, who had experiences precisely in some of these most oppressed areas of southern Yugoslavia. His famous pamphlet, Land to the Peasants, Macedonia to the Macedonians, was a recognition of the revolutionary importance of the national movements in parts of Yugoslavia and fitted very well with the concerns of the left faction by the middle of the 1920s. The left faction increasingly drifted away from notions of a centralist state and by 1924 basically opted for a federalist solution to the Yugoslav national question. The scene was the third land conference that took place in Belgrade in 1924, and at this particular meeting that had the effect of a mini Congress, it was stated that every nation of Yugoslavia had a right to secession and to formation of its own separate state. And in the case of minorities, this of course is very relevant for Kosovo, that they had a right of joining its own national state, meaning that Kosovo Albanians had a right, according to this definition, of seceding from Yugoslavia and joining Albania in an enlarged Albanian state. In June of 1924, this was in fact spelled out by a call for independence of 3 units of this potential federal Yugoslavia, of Croatia, of Slovenia, and of Macedonia. This position acquired full authority within the party in 1925 when Stalin himself sided with this stand at the session of the executive committee of the Comintern, in which he had a public polemic with Sima Markovic. With the endorsements of the topmost Soviet leader on this question, the left faction proceeded to continue with demands for what eventually became separation of potential federal units. Federalism was no longer discussed. One really had a project of separation of different units of Yugoslavia within a set of independent states. This became an official position in 1928 within a new context. 1928 marks the end of the period of relative tranquility in the communist movement. After the great advances immediately after the revolution, from 1922 and thereafter, the Communist International had a position that there occurred a temporary stabilization, a relative stabilization of capitalism, and therefore revolutionary opportunities were not present. But by 1928, not connected with the economic crisis, which was not yet in evidence, for various internal reasons that I cannot discuss at the moment, there was a big turnabout, a movement away from this idea, and a call for a new revolutionary upsurge. This, of course, was connected with Stalin's revolution from the top that started too in 1928, leading to the project of industrialization and collectivization in the Soviet Union that totally changed the nature of the Soviet state. Of course, it had enormous implications for the foreign communist parties. And it meant that they were instructed under all circumstances